So my name's Mark Hardie. I spent 20 years in the British Royal Marines Commandos, leaving as Lieutenant Colonel just recently. Over that time, I spent nearly half that time in operational commando units. And then in the tail end, when I was eventually promoted, I spent 3 years in the headquarters, the Navy headquarters, and then worked in training and operational support areas. And then in my last 2 years, I was working on the Royal Marines response and the Royal Navy's response to the Marine A case, which is when one of our Marines, a sergeant, was charged with originally murder, which was reduced to manslaughter of a wounded Afghan combatant in Helmand province. And that whole process, from him being court-martialed to imprisoned to then eventually released after an appeal, was about 6 years. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that. Me personally, I've had a lot of experience working with the Americans. I've worked with some SEAL teams in West Africa. I've worked with US Marine Corps, some US Army units, mainly special operations units in Afghanistan. I don't think I've really ever encountered the Army National Guard. I know the Royal Marines have. I think originally probably at Bunker Hill. And then again, in the War of 1812, there might have been some Royal Marines running around Washington, but we don't need to talk about that. I didn't really encounter Stoic philosophy until about halfway through my career, but certainly in the early stages, when I went through commando training, it was clear to me on reflection after leaving the service that there's an awful lot of Stoic philosophy in military training in general. And certainly in the more arduous courses, and you have your Ranger School and various other special operations selection courses, in the more arduous training schools, it's certainly evident that there's Stoic philosophy all over the place, though it's implicit rather than explicit. When you join the military and you've gone through some kind of basic training, the early stages of basic training are all about yourself, taking control of yourself, taking charge of your own kit, your own equipment, your own bed space, your own locker, and all the kit you go into the field with, and just being taught how to look after that. So you're taught how to look after that stuff that is yours and yours alone. And the reality is it's actual stuff, it's kit, it's equipment, it's shoes. You maintain it, you repair it, you keep it clean. It's inspected to make sure you're doing those things. And when you prove that you can do that, and that's normally after about 10 to 12 weeks of basic training, then you start to get loaded up with more difficult and demanding elements of training, like field conditions, like patrolling, like terrain, like observation posts, and all the different elements of whatever branch of service you've joined, you start to get loaded up with the extra stuff. But you can't really load up the extra stuff until you've got the foundation of looking after yourself, looking after number one. And those of you who come across Stoic philosophy will see that, right from the start it is you need to be in charge of yourself. Wherever you read and whichever books you read, you'll see that one of the basic tenets is you need to understand that you're in charge of yourself. Now, when I then look at the latter stages of Royal Marines commando training, we put our guys through a thing called the Commando Course. It's a 4-week course, which is effectively a simulation of operational conditions. And once you're on that course, you have to be ready to move at the drop of a hat to go anywhere and complete various training serials. And you don't really know what's coming next for the entire period. So for 3 weeks, you are just reacting and responding to the different situations and scenarios you face. And through that time, you've got to just be ready, and you've got to be ready in your mind. But also, when you do have a spare 5 minutes, you've got to be cleaning and maintaining your kit and equipment in the way that you've been shown. And as you go through that process, we then finish with some physical tests. Over the course of a week, you have to complete 4 commando tests. And all of these tests are completed at the end of that 3-week period of being effectively in field conditions. So you're already degraded, you're already tired and fatigued. And then you have to do what are actually hard tests, carrying about 30 pounds of equipment on each test. And at the end of that course, when you pass all the tests, you receive your green beret, which is the mark of the Royal Marines Commandos. You can focus on the exercise scenarios, you can focus on the training scenarios, but actually in reality, what we're looking for on the Commando course is what we call the Commando Spirit. The Commando Spirit is as simple as possible. We're looking for courage, determination, unselfishness, and cheerfulness, especially in adversity. So what we're really looking for as we put someone through this demanding course is that they have control of their mind. So we put them through difficult physical scenarios, challenging operational scenarios, and we're looking for those 4 things all the time. And arguably, if you're going to look for something like values or look for some kind of ethos, the place you need to find it is as close to the operational environment as possible. So you want to see how people are going to perform on operations, and that's what we try and do. And then when you really look at Stoicism, you're looking at courage. You're looking at that determination to not give up. Doesn't matter how hard it is, you've got to keep going. Doesn't matter how tired you are, you've got to keep going. Unselfishness, which is really all about working as a team, looking after your fellow human beings in your team, but also pulling your weight. Unselfishness is about you doing your own work as well as helping others. So you've got to be on top of your game. And when you're on top of your game, then you can go and help other people. And then finally, cheerfulness, especially in adversity, is about making a choice and controlling your emotions and not letting your environment, not letting the cold, not letting the wet, the fatigue get the better of you. That doesn't mean you're not feeling the emotions. It just means you're taking control and changing how you view things. Having gone through that process myself, I was then responsible for running those courses 10 years later when I was a major in the Royal Marines. But in the intervening period, I spent 3 years in the Navy Command Headquarters. During that 3 years, I was the officer responsible for running all of our repatriation ceremonies. Now, we have a slightly different method to you guys. I know you were taking casualties at the time, and I was keeping a track on the casualties you were taking in Afghanistan and Iraq at the time we were. And certainly the scale of your fatalities and casualties just made ours look not insignificant, but just that you could see the level of commitment was completely different. But that doesn't change the reality of standing on the tarmac back in the United Kingdom with the families of fallen Marines and looking after them for the day. So that was my job. I'd plan the ceremony, and then I'd brief the families in the morning. I'd spend the day with the families of each Marine we were bringing back. And we could bring either one back, or on some of our harder days, we brought 7 back in one day. Each family would have 7 family members. So when we brought 7 back, that was nearly 50 grieving family members in a room waiting for the ceremony to take place. So we'd be supporting me through that day. And I've got to admit, I wasn't ready for that. All the training I'd had up to that point, I just wasn't ready. I'd lost Marines in my troop when I was a young officer, but I'd never really had to spend a lot of time with families of fallen Marines. And grief is a challenging thing to deal with. I had to learn fast. To do my job well, I had to learn as much as I could about death, about the nature of the injuries that the guys were coming home with, the nature of IED blasts, and what an IED blast does to a body, and then having to brief as well as possible the family members so that all of their questions could be answered as honestly and transparently as possible. And I found that really hard. And it was at this point that I discovered, completely by accident, I was working on another project. I discovered Stoicism through James Stockdale. So I was tasked with looking at and reviewing the Royal Marines ethos, which included that Commando Spirit I spoke about earlier. As I was looking at ethos and character and conduct, I was doing internet searches, and I came across the Stockdale Centre at Annapolis. And I looked at some of the resources there, and I discovered the 2 talks which were on the resource site there, which were the Stoic Warriors Triad, or Stockdale on Stoicism. And it was really Stockdale on Stoicism Part 1, the Stoic Warriors Triad, that really helped me get better at that job. There was 2 parts of that. One was exposure and starting to understand what James Stockdale had been through. And the other part was just how well he explained Stoicism in practical terms. So it wasn't like, if you want to teach someone Stoicism, show them some PowerPoint slides and tell them what it is and leave them to it. He had personal experience of how it helped him as a prisoner in Hanoi. But he could also talk about it in a practical and useful way. And he'd done the work, he'd done the reading, but he'd also been exposed to that 7.5-year period of torture and imprisonment and solitary confinement, where he himself would say, everything I know about Epictetus, who was a philosopher he really kind of lent on, everything I know about Epictetus, I've developed myself over the years. It's been a one-on-one relationship. He has taught me that I'm totally responsible for everything I do and say, and that it is I who controls my own destruction and deliverance. He wants me to be in charge of me. And just reading that line in terms of how I dealt with and supported grieving families helped me a lot. Because really in 2 ways. One, it helped me to make sure I was kind. And the other part was to do my job. And my job was to look after them, brief them, and effectively manage them and their emotions throughout the day. So I had to be kind, but not join them in the same emotional place. Because if I join them in the same emotional place of grief and loss, then actually I wouldn't be able to do my job correctly or properly. I had to take charge of myself. And that's a challenge. And you learn a lot about grief by spending time with people who are grieving. And I'm sure a lot of you have lost people you care about over the years and have been through the grieving process, or maybe even going through it now. When I hear people who have not done the real deep thinking about Stoic philosophy, who say the Stoic philosophy is a cold philosophy, and it means you have no emotion, and it means you control your heart. I don't think that's true. I think actually what you do is, the Stoics believe that human emotions are acts of will. And that doesn't mean you don't feel the emotion, because you do feel it, but you willingly take control of it. So you don't let the emotion take control of you. So you still feel fear, you still feel sadness or grief, but you take control of it. So it's not cold and heartless. And as Stockdale said, controlling your emotions can be empowering. But controlling your emotions means that you can help people who are suffering because you don't join them in the same emotional space. Okay? You can help people who are suffering because you don't join them in the same emotional space. And therefore you can actually look after them better. Looking back on that time now, it's 10 years ago now. I think over that period of 3 years, I brought home maybe 50 Marines and soldiers, so 50 different families. Some of those Marines I knew well from the time I spent in the service. It was a challenging job, but I think arguably I'm proud of that time and I'm proud of how I did it. But I can genuinely say if it was not for discovering James Stockdale and then his thoughts on Stoicism, I don't think I would have got through the job as well as I did in the end. For me, that's the practical part of this. It's a practical philosophy. You will really find it useful when times are hard. When I look back on Commando training, elements of the training course where we're looking for that courage, determination, unselfishness, cheerfulness, that's what we're looking for, is people controlling their emotions when it's hard. But we actually put them in the environment. So the training is as demanding and realistic as possible. And then we say to people, and these are the qualities we're looking for. Here's a demanding training environment, and this is what we're looking for from you. And I think your training schools, from Ranger School to RASP and any other courses that you guys may have done, it's the same thing. We're looking for these qualities, and we're going to put you through the mill and see if you can display them. Because the bottom line is these qualities will help you get through the course. If you do these things, you will get through this arduous, challenging course or environment. And it's a really powerful way of training people. So I'd recommend to any of you, if you haven't applied for any of these courses, and if you can apply, that you give it a go, because you will learn a lot about yourself. And there's other lines from Stoic philosophy, from Epictetus as well. Let yourself be laughed at sometimes. Look about you, shake yourself up, so as to at least find out who you actually are. You need to go through challenging situations to really find out who you are, what sort of character you are, what sort of moral compass you have. And that's hard for some people. Not everyone can do it. Not everyone wants to really see who they are. Not everyone wants to be put in a situation where they find out that they just can't cut it. They're not up to it. So they go through life avoiding those situations. But the problem is when they find themselves in that situation, they're not ready, and they can't be kind, and they can't be useful, and they're not in a position to help other people. And arguably they need more help than others do. I think Stoicism is helpful there. Also during that period, I was part of looking after injured Marines, some of our casualties. And you all know as well from Afghanistan and Iraq, a lot of guys were surviving with their injuries that they wouldn't have survived with in previous campaigns. So IED blasts with multiple amputations and guys still surviving. In fact, when we started taking casualties over here, I don't think we got it right. I know in America, you'd already started the Wounded Warrior battalions, and you were looking after guys and making it clear that if you got injured, you'd be looked after. You don't always get it right, but you'd be looked after. And I think that's a moral and ethical requirement, because no one's going to go and fight, and no one's going to put themselves in harm's way if they don't think they're going to be looked after when something bad happens to them. And back in the UK, we weren't doing it well initially, and we were making lots of excuses as to we don't need to change the policy, everything is working fine. But actually, people were not really seeing what I and a few others were seeing in terms of the nature of the casualties. But we took about 2 years to get on top of that. For me, part of that was working on an expedition where I took a load of injured Marines up to Everest Base Camp, amputees, Marines with PTSD, and we spent 2 years planning an expedition to Everest Base Camp. I think it was the first of its kind in the world. Around about 2009 we left. There were other people planning similar things at the time. And in the entire 2 years of planning, we were told we couldn't do it. We were told amputees couldn't get up there. We were told people with PTSD couldn't go to the mountains for all sorts of ridiculous reasons. But we just got on with it. And we took them there and we put them in this demanding environment, and they all rose to the challenge. It inspired a lot of people, but it changed the policy. And I can also say, you know, I was heavily involved in that, heavily involved in senior officers telling me things couldn't be done or shouldn't be done. But again, I had this sort of guiding mentor of Stockdale and Epictetus by this point, which was just helped me think, well, we're going to do it. Let's just do it. And we'll be in control of it. We'll do the work. We'll make it happen. And we paid attention and we accepted the challenges and we overcame obstacles and we got through it and we got all the guys up and back. And it's one of the things I'm most proud of in my military career. So those three areas are really where I found Stoic philosophy and elements of Stoicism really helpful. On reflection, it helped me get through training, though I hadn't been exposed to it when I went through training myself. It really helped me when I was looking after bereaved families and injured Marines over that 3-year period from 2007 to 2009. And then it helped me again when I was working with injured Marines. Now, having left the military, what it's allowed me to do is really reflect more fully on what I went through. I think as you're going through your military career, as you're going through the operational deployments, you don't really have time, or it feels like you don't have time to really reflect on the experience and what it's done to you. If you have a long military career, it might be 30 years before you genuinely sit back and go, what the hell was all that about? And try and find the kind of the route you took that's turned you into the person you are today. And I think Stoicism helps you do that, because it's about just being individually as good a soldier, a Marine, a sailor, an airman, as good as you can be. You know, you start with looking after your kit, your equipment, then you've got to look after your fitness. You've got to stay fit enough to be useful to your team members, useful to your teammates, useful to your unit. You've also got to be fit enough in your mind to deal with the real difficult parts of being in the military, and that's death and serious injury and grief and loss. That's the hard part. You can't really simulate that in basic training, and you can't really tell someone how they're going to feel when they lose someone they care about. But what you can do is learn to control your emotions and accept those emotions and work through them rather than avoid them or ignore them. But I would say this is, having worked in delivering commando training, getting guys from being a civilian on the street through to being a commando with a green beret on, ready to do anything. What I would say is, you can sit through as many presentations as you like, but actually the real place to learn about this philosophy is in the real world. It's on those hard training courses, on training exercises, on operations. It's when you're facing adversity yourself personally that you'll really understand how this philosophy works and how practical it can be. And that's the challenge, because we're always trying to teach people how to be more resilient. But actually, to become more resilient, you've got to go through things. You've got to go through the challenges. You can't be talked to about challenges. You've got to experience them for yourself. You've got to know the load you can carry in order to figure out how far you can carry it. So to finish up, I think about leadership, not in terms of just rank or officers, but the second you have responsibility for another soldier from the junior time in, it might just be you're given command of a team as a young National Guardsman, you're given a task to do. The second you are effectively leading something. At the end of Stockdale and Stoicism, the Stoic Warriors triad, he mentions someone asking Epictetus, what are the fruit of these doctrines? And Epictetus replies sharply, tranquility, fearlessness, and freedom. When you're looking at someone who's leading you, or when you're leading others, when you get into those three words, what they actually mean, if you see this, if you see these things, you will copy them. You will copy a leader who's demonstrating these three things. So tranquility, calmness, peacefulness, quiet serenity, in combat, in a contact. When you see a leader behaving like that, It inspires you to do better, to do more. Fearlessness, boldness or bravery. Intrepid is another word. Go through the obstacle to get the job done, to go through the hard environment. And then freedom. Freedom's a more challenging one for the military. When you look at it, it means lots of things. It means exemption from external control. Or another thing is the power to determine action without restraint. So to do the right thing without worrying about your reputation. To look at the situation and do what's right. And when you see a leader behaving like that, a leader doing the right thing in a challenging situation rather than doing what he thinks his boss wants them to do or thinks the organization expects him to do, but doing the right thing in that environment, you see a freedom in the leader, and you'll see it afterwards as well, because they'll know they've done the right thing and they can sleep with their decision. They can sleep well, peacefully afterwards, so they can live with the decisions they've made. So those three things, tranquility, fearlessness, freedom, allows you to go through a challenging, really challenging situation, whatever that might be, and live well with the decisions you've made. I would say look for those three qualities. And if you don't see them, then show them yourself to others. Whenever there's a chance, show those three qualities, and you'll see that people will see you are a leader. So thank you for your time. And you need to get out there and do it yourself.